May 25, 1878, North Bend, Ohio, Hamilton County. John Scott Harrison's family found him on the floor of his bedroom that morning. The 73-year-old father and grandfather was partially dressed. They couldn't tell if he had been preparing for bed the night before or had risen earlier and died while getting ready for the day. He was a beloved patriarch, and he hadn't been ill. His family grieved deeply. 4 days later, they buried him at Congress Green Cemetery, where the Harrison family plot overlooked the Ohio River. John Scott Harrison has the unique distinction of being the only person in American history who was both a son and a father to a U.S. president. His dad was number 9, William Henry Harrison. And though John wouldn't live to see it, his son will be number 23, Benjamin Harrison. Even though John Scott was a respected gentleman farmer and even served a stint in Congress, he could easily have gotten lost in the shadow of more famous bookends if it weren't for 1878 and the year he became the central character in a shocking whodunit. In preparing for John Scott's burial, his sons noticed that just yards away from the family cemetery plot, upturned soil revealed Bodysnatchers had taken the remains of a family friend who died 11 days earlier. To protect their father from the same fate, the Harrison sons took extraordinary measures to protect his corpse. He was buried 8 feet down inside a metal casket, surrounded by a bricked-in vault. They added 3 large stone slabs over the casket, stones, it was said, that required 16 men to put into place. A layer of dirt was added, then a layer of cement. The family then paid $30 to a watchman to guard the grave for 30 nights. Now that their father was well protected, the Harrison boys turned their attention to that desecrated grave. They knew the recently deceased, a 23-year-old family friend, August Devens, who died of tuberculosis. As they left the cemetery that day, they vowed to find August Devens' body and the culprits who stole it. But first, a little more about the Harrisons. Let's start with William Henry. He was born in 1773 when Virginia was just a British colony. When he was 3 years old, his dad, Benjamin Harrison V, signed the Declaration of Independence, which created the United States of America. As a matter of fact, William Henry Harrison will be the last U.S. president who was born as a British subject. He had a distinguished military career that took him to the wild American frontier to fight Indians. At that time, the wild frontier was the settlement of Cincinnati. Ohio wasn't even a state yet. He was stationed at Fort Washington, and that's where he met his future bride, Anna Sims, whose family lived in North Bend. They eloped when her father wouldn't give permission for them to marry, but William's father-in-law came to like the young man anyway and sold him 160 acres in North Bend. Eventually, William's military career will give way to a political one. He'll become governor of the Indiana Territory and rise all the way to the White House. William and Anna had 10 children together. One of them, John, was smart as a whip and graduated from law school as valedictorian of his class. But he gave it all up to become a farmer. His father gave him 600 acres bordering his own vast estate in North Bend, and John's homestead was dubbed the Point Farm. John had a big family to look after. His first wife gave him 3 children. His second wife, Elizabeth Irwin, gave him 10 more, including the future president, Benjamin. John Scott spent 4 years in Congress representing his Ohio district, but his political career was brief. He was a farmer at heart. He returned to the business of running Point Farm. When John Scott Harrison died in 1878, grave robbing was an industry, an illegal one, but a business all the same. Medical schools were desperate for bodies so their students could study the human anatomy and do medical research. In Cincinnati alone, there were 6 medical training institutions with more than 1,000 students. The largest facility was the Ohio Medical College on Vine Street, with some 300 students, each requiring a cadaver. The state made some provisions for their doctors in training. The remains of paupers and other unclaimed decedents were given over to them, but that fell far short of what was needed. And with demand outweighing supply, a black market thrived. Body snatchers, who at the time were euphemistically known as resurrectionists, routinely dug up fresh graves and deposited them in the back rooms of medical schools for a fee. Now, as to what happened to August Devens, the Harrison family friend. Carter Harrison, one of John's younger children, took the lead. He started by assembling information about Cincinnati's medical schools, and almost immediately he got an impressive tip. The day after his father's funeral, a witness had seen a buggy drive into the alley between Vine and Race Streets at 3 a.m., right behind the Ohio Medical College. Something wrapped in white was taken from the buggy, then simply seemed to vanish from the alley without so much as a door opening. Carter Harrison felt certain this body belonged to August Devens. The investigation now was handed off to Carter's eldest brother, John Harrison Jr., and a grandson, George Eaton, who took the baton and headed to Cincinnati. There, they enlisted the help of a private detective named Thomas Snellbaker and a Cincinnati constable named Walter Lacey, who acquired a search warrant. At the college, the men shoved the search warrant at the janitor, J.Q. Marshall, and began their search of the building. Immediately, they found an explanation of why that white wrapped package disappeared so efficiently in the alley. There was a chute in that alley which descended to the college's basement. More searching turned up boxes of assorted body parts, a student in the act of dissecting an elderly black woman, and a dead infant on an examining table. But there was no sign of August. The men continued their search all the way to an upper floor, and there they found a room with a unique pulley system. The pulley held a taut rope that dropped into a square hole through the floor. Constable Lacey cranked the system to raise the rope up through the hole, and at the end of the rope dangled a naked man, his head covered by a dirty white cloth. The body's arms were crossed, and the rope was fastened around them in the middle of the torso. The hole in the floor, it was learned, went all the way to the basement next to that chute. As soon as the body came into the light, it was obvious to John Jr. that the body wasn't their young friend. August was emaciated from his long battle with tuberculosis. The man on this rope was neither young nor gaunt. He was elderly and stout. It's not him, John Jr. told Snellbaker. Right then, Dr. William Seeley, the executive officer of the medical college, arrived in the room. After learning the body wasn't the August they were looking for, he asked them to put the body back and not to mention to anyone what they had found, especially to August's widow. The suggestion was that if she had any thought this is what might have happened to her husband, the grief would be too great. The argument seemed to work, and Lacey began to lower the body back down through the trap door. But suddenly, Snellbaker held him back. They had come this far. Shouldn't they at least look at the face and be 100% sure it wasn't August? John Jr. hesitated, then agreed. They lowered the corpse to the floor, and John Jr. flipped back the material covering the face. It wasn't August. According to newspaper reports, John Jr.'s next words were, "My God, it's father." John Jr. went pale and trembled at the complete and utter surprise before him. Snellbaker had to catch him as his legs failed. John Scott Harrison's jugular had been sliced to bleed the body out, and his long, white, flowing beard had been cut off. His son also knew him by a mole on his face and the bruise on the right side of the forehead where he had hit his head falling in the bedroom. How could this be? In the time it had taken to leave his father's funeral, get the train to Cincinnati, acquire a search warrant, and make it to the medical school, his own father's body had been wrested from its fortified grave, transported, sold, and prepared for dissection. John Jr. sobbed while decrying the men who had desecrated his father's body. He drew a small tobacco knife he had on him and held it as a weapon as he sat next to his father's corpse. Eventually, Snellbaker and Lacey convinced him to let them carry the body to an undertaker. They transported it to the funeral home of E. Steppenmeyer on 7th Street near Central Avenue. John Jr. and George then headed for the train station. They had to go home and tell the family. They didn't know it, but the rest of the family already knew. Back at North Bend, Carter Harrison was alerted to the disturbance at the graveyard and found thieves had gotten into his father's coffin at its most vulnerable point. They drilled the end of the casket and pulled the body out by its feet. Carter quickly sent a telegraph to Cincinnati to inform John Jr. and George. Father's grave has been robbed, the message said. I shall leave for Cincinnati on the first train. Come there immediately. Brother Benjamin, meanwhile, was on his way there from his home in Indianapolis. The brothers reunited at the train depot, and that's where John Jr. and George were able to share with them the news that they had already recovered the body. The Harrisons took rooms at the Grand Hotel in Cincinnati so they could stay in town while pushing for answers in criminal charges. They filed charges against the medical school janitor for receiving and concealing the stolen body. The janitor's bail was set at an incredibly large $5,000, but the college posted his bond and promised to fund his defense. Meanwhile, college officials attempted to calm a rising anger in the community. Dr. Roberts Bartholow, dean of the college, denied any faculty at the school knew of the theft. Then he railed against laws that made it hard for medical schools to come by bodies while holding doctors to a standard of care that is only possible by practice with said bodies. Dr. Seeley, that chief executive who was present when John Scott's body was found, said, had we known whose body it was that was suspended on that rope, we would have returned it to its grave and said nothing about it. The body was brought here at night and placed in the chute, and I suppose that had not such a stir been made, we would have been called upon for payment. As it is, the man will not be likely to do so, so we may never know who resurrected it. The Harrison boys were not calmed by any of these words. Benjamin published his own rebuttal, full of anger and anguish. While he lay upon your table, he wrote, the long white beard, which the hands of infant grandchildren had often stroked in love, was rudely shorn from his face. Have you so little care of your college that an unseen and unknown man may do all this? Who took him from that table and hung him by the neck in the pit? 2 weeks later, a grand jury returned indictments against the men they said were responsible for this travesty: the janitor, J.Q. Marshall, and a man named Charles O. Morton. Charles O. Morton was not some uneducated derelict working with his beer-drinking buddy to dig up bodies for spending money. He was a physician who had turned grave robbing into a commercial business, employing crews to steal corpses the way a coal company might employ miners. Morton had already been arrested once earlier that same year in Toledo, charged with stealing at least 10 bodies there. And he had a reputation for pushing the limits of what the law might have been willing to overlook. He didn't just harvest the indigent from potter's fields. He took middle-class folks from their private and church cemeteries. But while in Toledo's custody, Dr. Morton managed to escape. He quietly made his way to Cincinnati, where he moved into a nice home at the corner of 7th and Main Streets downtown, and went back to work. Snellbaker, the private detective employed by the Harrisons, turned up Dr. Morton in his investigation and learned he had been selling cadavers to the University of Michigan. And so Snellbaker went to Ann Arbor for a visit, and there he found August Devens in a pickling vat. Snellbaker shipped August back home, as well as several other remains he was able to identify. But Morton evaded authorities once again. That grand jury may have indicted him for the theft of the bodies of August Devens and John Scott Harrison, but he was nowhere to be found. Many years later, it would be revealed he went to Braidwood, Illinois, and hung out his shingle under the name Dr. H. Le Caron. He had an interesting side job. He infiltrated Irish American societies raising money for Ireland's fight for independence, then reported on their activities to the English government as a spy. Later, as Benjamin Harrison ascended to the highest office in America, there was nothing to be done about the man who had defiled his father's corpse. Charles Morton was in England and under the protection of Scotland Yard. So what happened to John Scott Harrison's body? At first, the sons were not interested in returning him to his grave. They accepted the offer of the Strader family to temporarily keep their father in their own family vault in the Cincinnati cemetery of Spring Grove. Eventually, John Scott was returned to North Bend, but exactly where? In 1999, the Ohio Historical Society sought to find out. Most of the Harrison family was still in Congress Green Cemetery, where John Scott was originally buried. But there was reason to think he was actually now across the street. You see, in the late 1800s, a new memorial had been built for President William Henry Harrison, and at that site were 3 unmarked vaults. The society removed some bricks on the unmarked vaults and inserted a small camera on a metal pole. Short of a DNA test, they couldn't be sure, but they left the tomb pretty confident that day that John Scott Harrison was present and accounted for.
Thank you for watching Ohio Mysteries. If you appreciate the effort, please hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. Ohio Mysteries also has a podcast with nearly 300 stories in our catalog. Find those on your favorite podcast app or visit ohiomysteries.com for the entire episode list.